At 3:18 a.m. on the morning of September 11, 1940, the German Heinkel bomber dropped three 500-kilogram bombs on the Supermarine factory at Woolston, Southampton. The first missed the main assembly hall by 30 feet. The second landed squarely on the machine shop. The third hit the store's building where hundreds of Spitfire parts were stacked in crates waiting for shipment. When the fire crews arrived, the sky was orange and the smell of burning magnesium filled the air. By sunrise, what had once been the beating heart of Britain's most important aircraft program was twisted aluminum and smoke. 43 workers were dead, hundreds injured. The production lines that built the Spitfire had ceased to exist. By noon that same day, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding received a one-page telegram from the Air Ministry, but in a warehouse 30 miles away. An unassuming engineer named Simmons was 36, quiet, broad-shouldered, rarely smiled. Before the war he had managed a small maintenance firm repairing civil aircraft at Croydon Aerodrome. When war came, the Air Ministry had commandeered his workshop to service damaged hurricanes. He worked 16-hour shifts for 2 months, until an overstressed Merlin engine exploded on his test stand, tearing through the roof. After that, they moved him to a dispersal depot near Reading, officially called No. 43 Maintenance Unit, and officially, it was the place where wrecks went to die, burnt-out shells, twisted frames, anything unfit for flight. He looked at those carcasses differently. Where others saw scrap, he saw geometry. A bent spar could be straightened. A melted panel could be repressed. If you knew where the metal still held its grain, you could rebuild almost anything. He'd done it once with a civilian aircraft in 1936, a Percival Mew Gull that had crashed into a field. Everyone said it was beyond repair. He'd flown it 3 weeks later. When news of the Woolston bombing reached Reading, Simmons didn't wait for orders. He gathered his 8 mechanics, spread the morning's newspaper across an oil-stained bench, and said simply, "If the factory's gone, we'll make one here." The plan was impossible. Maintenance units were forbidden to build aircraft. Their job was repair, not manufacture. Every part required Air Ministry certification, inspection stamps, and drawings that were locked in destroyed offices in Southampton. But Simmons understood that regulation was a luxury of peace. The RAF needed fighters now, not paperwork later. That night he took a torch and walked through the yard where dozens of wrecked Spitfires lay under tarps. Some were riddled with bullet holes, others crushed nose first from crash landings. One in particular caught his eye, serial number P9447, shot down over Kent 2 weeks earlier. The fuselage was cracked behind the cockpit, but the wings were intact. The engine block was warped, but salvageable. He ran his hand over the dented skin and whispered to the dark, "You'll fly again." Within 2 days he'd requisitioned an abandoned furniture factory 5 miles away. It had a roof, a railway siding, and enough floor space for 2 fuselages. He called it the works. His men hauled in broken wings and tail sections on flatbed trucks, stripped them to bare frames, and began rebuilding by eye. They didn't have blueprints. They measured from memory, from symmetry, from intuition. Old carpenters' jigs became alignment tools. The smell of varnish mixed with oil. Sparks from welding torches danced under blackout curtains. On September 20th, they rolled out their first complete Spitfire, built from the remains of 3 others. Simmons painted the number X409B on the fuselage to match an aircraft lost earlier that month. The paperwork, if anyone checked, would show repaired. In truth, it was reborn. He telephoned Fighter Command and offered to deliver personally to Biggin Hill. The squadron leader on the other end laughed. "You expect me to fly an aircraft made of scrap?" Simmons replied, "Yes, and you'll thank me afterward." The test flight took place at dusk. The pilot climbed out after 20 minutes, expression unreadable. Then he said, "Flies true. Better than half the ones from the factory." That night Simmons poured himself his first drink in 3 weeks. Word spread fast. Within 10 days, other maintenance depots were calling, asking how he'd done it. He wrote simple notes, hand-drawn sketches of repaired jigs, instructions for straightening spars with heated sandbags, templates for patching bullet-torn panels. They called them teddy sheets. The Air Ministry never approved them, but every mechanic in the south of England used them. By October, his operation had tripled in size. Disused barns, bus depots, and even a racehorse stable became assembly bays. He set up a network of local machine shops, blacksmiths, bicycle makers, coach builders, each tasked with fabricating one component. Wheel hubs from Reading, rudder pedals from Oxford, oxygen regulators from a clockmaker in Guildford. He called it the Shuttle Line. No one outside his circle knew it existed. Officially, the replacement Spitfires were still arriving from Southampton, even though the factory was rubble. In reality, they came from dozens of hidden workshops linked by rail and secrecy. Every aircraft carried a small brass plate under the cockpit so stamped only with the letters TS. That autumn, while the Luftwaffe shifted its bombs from airfields to London, Simmons's Ghost Factory produced 34 Spitfires and 41 Hurricanes, all from wreckage. Pilots began calling them ghost birds. They often flew better because the men who built them had lived inside their scars. One cold evening in November, Group Captain Batter visited the works unannounced. He walked through the half-lit shop, watching men riveting by hand. "How many of these are airworthy?" he asked. Simmons wiped his hands on a rag. 17 today. 18 if we don't run out of bolts." Batter nodded once. "Keep doing whatever you're doing. Just don't put it in writing." By December 1940, the official Spitfire production figures at the Air Ministry showed only 48 airframes completed. The true number flying with Fighter Command was 73. No one could explain the difference on paper, but Group Captain Batter knew. He'd seen it, a rail car arriving at Biggin Hill in the fog. An aircraft rolled out with no factory marks, its paint still wet, its logbook typed on a different machine. Simmons's network had spread beyond the home counties. The Shuttle Line, as his men called it, now stretched from Bristol to Norwich. Each node operated like a cell, small, quiet, invisible. The fewer people who knew the whole picture, the safer it was. He never wrote letters. Orders traveled by word of mouth or telegrams coded as parts requests. Send 12 chairs Type S with legs reinforced. To anyone reading, it sounded like furniture business. To the men inside the circle, chairs meant undercarriages and legs meant landing gear struts. At first, the Air Ministry ignored it. Then they noticed spare parts stocks falling without matching requisitions. An internal audit team visited No. 43 Maintenance Unit in January 1941. Simmons met them at the gate in a grease-stained overall and a calm expression. They spent 2 days comparing ledgers to wreckage. Everything balanced because he'd made sure of it. For every wing he took, he logged a structural test sample. For every engine rebuild, he recorded a component evaluation unit. By the time they left, the inspectors were simply impressed at his efficiency. That winter was brutal. Snow on runways froze tires to the ground. Fuel turned to gel. Yet Spitfires still rose every morning from fields that had no right to be airbases. Simmons and his crew worked by lantern light, fingers numb, rivets biting through gloves. Sometimes they slept in the airframes themselves, engine cowlings as pillows. Every time a completed fighter took off, they stood outside to watch until it disappeared into the clouds. They never saw the pilots again, but they counted each departure as a victory. In February 1941, German reconnaissance photographed the ruins of Woolston again. The intelligence report to Berlin read, "Supermarine production remains inoperative. RAF Spitfire losses unreplaced." The analysts were wrong. They had underestimated the Ghost Factory. The crisis peaked in March when an official directive from Surmise ordered No. 43 Unit to cease unauthorized fabrication activities. The order came signed by an undersecretary who had never seen a Spitfire up close. Simmons read it once, folded it, and used it to level a wobbly workbench. He told his men, if anyone asks, we're just repairing a very large aircraft in pieces. By spring, the Shadow Line included over 200 civilian craftsmen and 27 unofficial sites. The largest was a railway shed in Didcot, where they rebuilt entire center sections using heat lamination and hand riveting. A dozen women from a nearby textile factory stitched canvas control surfaces at night. They called the project Sewing for the Spit. Every week a flat car would arrive covered in canvas tarps. Every week it would depart under armed guard marked as agricultural equipment. One of Simmons's young fitters, Arthur Green, wrote in his diary, "The air smells of acetone and fear. We don't talk about where the parts come from. We just keep them flying." The Air Ministry finally sent a senior investigator in April. Colonel Hugh Fenning, known for closing wasteful projects, arrived with 2 clerks and a stack of forms. He found men working in silence, assembling an airframe from 3 wrecks that had no matching numbers. He asked Simmons, "Are you aware this constitutes a violation of Air Ministry Regulation 6B?" Simmons replied, "Yes, sir. I'm also aware Regulation 6B doesn't shoot down bombers." Fenning didn't laugh. He spent 2 hours taking notes, then requested a test flight. They rolled out the latest machine, a composite Spitfire built from fuselage P9312 wings from X4104, and the Merlin recovered from a crash at Tangmere. The aircraft wore no serial number, only a single letter S painted by hand. Fenning watched it take off, circle once, and land smoothly. He walked to Simmons and said quietly, "You understand none of this can exist officially." Simmons nodded. Fenning tore the inspection report in half and left. That night, Simmons gathered his crew. "No one will ever thank us," he said, "but they'll have air cover tomorrow. That's enough." By June 1941, the Supermarine Company had re-established production at Castle Bromwich. But the Shadow Line didn't stop. It shifted its purpose, from building whole aircraft to keeping squadrons supplied with spares that factories couldn't deliver. Propellers, oil coolers, landing gear assemblies, all flowed through the network. Pilots never knew where their replacement parts came from. They just knew their planes flew again within days instead of months. In September, a memo circulated within the Air Ministry Operations Room. Unofficial field repairs appear to have increased operational readiness by 23%. Recommend formal recognition under provisional scheme. Local production units do not disclose origin. Simmons read the copy that found its way to him through a friend. He laughed for the first time in months. Recognition was irrelevant. He was already planning the next innovation: mobile repair trucks that could drive to crash sites, salvage engines within hours, and return them to service. He called them resurrection wagons. When the Luftwaffe shifted to night bombing, his teams learned to work in total darkness, guided only by feel and touch. They could replace a wingtip in 20 minutes. In the summer raids of 1942, when Fighter Command sortied hundreds of aircraft a day, the Shadow Line kept the losses bearable. Doubting himself never knew how deep it ran. He just knew his squadrons were never out of SPITFIRES. In wartime Britain, secrets died slowly, but the Shadow Line never leaked. The men and women who worked there signed no papers and took no credit. When the war ended, many simply went back to their trades. Only one record remained, a brass plate from a reconstructed Spitfire found in a museum decades later. Stamped on the back were 2 letters, TS. The rain came sideways across the tarmac at Westhampton, bending into sheets of gray that blurred the line between sky and ground. It was April 1942. Fighter Command had begun offensive sweeps over France, circus operations. They called them large bomber raids with Spitfires as escorts and bait. Losses were relentless. For every sortie that crossed the channel, 2 or 3 aircraft came back riddled with cannon holes or crash-landed on the coast. Official maintenance crews couldn't keep up. Hangars overflowed with broken machines. But where others saw wreckage, Simmons saw raw material. He stood in the rain with a clipboard wrapped in oilskin, watching as a flatbed lorry backed into the dispersal area. On its bed lay what had once been a Spitfire MKV, its tail section gone, its undercarriage sheared off at the roots. The pilot had landed in a plowed field near Dover and walked away. The Air Ministry paperwork listed the aircraft as beyond economic repair. Simmons circled the entry and wrote a single word beside it, salvageable. 2 days earlier, his new idea had become real. A team of 10 men, 2 women, and a convoy of 4 trucks each fitted with hoists, compressors, welding rigs, and portable forges. They moved like a field hospital for airplanes. Wherever a Spitfire went down, the resurrection wagons followed. They stripped, hacked, and pulled engines before the wrecks could be scavenged or bombed again. Anything usable went back to the works within 48 hours. The convoy had no official designation. On paper, it didn't exist. Its fuel came from misallocated depot reserves. Its parts were returned scrap. The mechanics joked they were pirates with wrenches, but they worked miracles. On the morning of April 19th, a squadron from Tangmere returned with 4 damaged aircraft. One Spitfire, flown by Flight Lieutenant Carmichael, had lost its coolant system over Dieppe and barely made it home. The glycol had boiled away. The Merlin block was seized. Normally, that engine would go to a foundry for melting. Simmons's team drained it, split the crankcase, and discovered a single warp connecting rod. Using a press scavenged from a farm workshop, they straightened the rod, reheated the metal to relax the grain, and reassembled the engine overnight. At dawn, the Spitfire flew again. Carmichael found Simmons standing by the dispersal bay and asked, "Is that safe?" Simmons wiped his hands and said, "It's not pretty, but it'll fight." By June, the resurrection wagons were everywhere. Chichester, Northweld, Beacon Hill. Local villagers grew used to the sight of trucks rumbling through back roads with wings strapped to their roofs. Children followed, calling them angel wagons. In 1 week alone, the convoys recovered 19 aircraft from crash sites and returned 11 to service. None of it sanctioned, all of it vital. But success brought attention. The Air Ministry's logistics branch began noticing fuel shortages near repair depots. Trucks signed to scrap removal consumed far more petrol than paper allowed. A colonel from London arrived to investigate. He found Simmons's convoy camped in a field behind a disused abbey. 3 Spitfire fuselages propped on trestles, engines half disassembled. The colonel demanded an explanation. Simmons led him to the nearest aircraft. Its tail marked TS. "We pull what they call scrap off the field, sir," he said. "Then we make it fly again." The colonel looked at the rough weld seams, the mud-caked landing gear, the faces of exhausted mechanics who hadn't shaved in days. "You can't just make aircraft, man. Where's your authorization?" Simmons said, "The sky's authorization enough." For a moment, the colonel stared at him. Then he said quietly, "If anyone asks, I never saw this place." That summer, German fighter-bomber raids targeted coastal maintenance airfields. At Limp, a single Focke-Wulf strafed the repair sheds and killed 6 men. The resurrection wagons arrived 3 hours later. Simmons stepped out of his truck and walked through the wreckage. One of his best welders, William Cates, lay among the twisted steel. They buried him behind the hangar. That night, Simmons ordered all convoys to operate without lights, to move only under cloud cover, and to split loads between trucks. "We're ghosts," he said. "We work in silence now." The war darkened. Summer turned to autumn. Spitfire MKVs replaced older marks, and with them came new challenges: stronger airframes, heavier engines, tighter tolerances. Factory jigs were still months behind, but Simmons's teams adapted. They learned to realign warped longerons by heating them with oil lamps and using chains anchored to tree trunks. They learned to race skin wings with sheet aluminum cut from crashed bombers. They built their own rivet dies from motorcycle pistons. They invented faster ways to make the impossible routine. By late 1942, their unofficial output matched that of an entire factory. The ministry still pretended not to know, but Fighter Command's statistics told the truth. Aircraft availability across southern England had risen by 15% despite continuous combat. A memo circulated privately among senior staff recommend no interference with field reconstruction units under supervision of Mr. Simmons. Their methods may be irregular, but results are satisfactory. He read that line years later and laughed. Irregular was an understatement. One night in November, a German bomber jettisoned its load early and hit the very barn where the works had begun 2 years earlier. Flames climbed 40 feet high. Half the structure collapsed. The men fought the fire with buckets and wet blankets, but the heat was too much. Inside, 3 unfinished Spitfires melted into skeletons of alloy and ash. When dawn came, Simmons stood among the ruins, black with soot, and said nothing. Then he turned to his foreman. "We'll rebuild them from what's left." They did. The following week, and RAF Film Unit visited Biggin Hill to capture footage for a propaganda reel. One of the aircraft they filmed, the patched Spitfire with uneven paint lines, was a resurrection. In the final cut, it appeared briefly taking off into sunlight. The narrator's voice said, "British industry delivers again." No one mentioned the muddy field, the unmarked trucks, or the man who refused to stop building. As winter settled, Simmons's convoy operated north for the first time, supporting training squadrons in Scotland. The conditions were worse than anything in the south. Snow drifted waist-high. The trucks froze overnight. Mechanics warmed their hands on exhaust manifolds and thawed tools over engine fires. But they kept going. In January 1943, Fighter Command recorded a statistic that made Simmons quietly proud. 84% of operational Spitfires had at least one component stamped TS. That spring, he was summoned to London. The letter bore no signature, only the seal of the Ministry of Aircraft Production. He feared the worst charges, audits, confiscations. Instead, he was shown into a dim office where an undersecretary poured 2 cups of tea. "You've done something remarkable, Mr. Simmons," the man said. "But we can't ever admit how you did it." Simmons nodded. "We never expected you to." The war ended quietly for men like Edward Simmons. No medals, no parades, no speeches. On May 9, 1945, when the sirens fell silent and the sky over England turned to an uneasy calm, his convoys stood idle in a muddy field near Chichester. The men sat on oil drums, smoking in the drizzle, staring at the Spitfires lined up like ghosts that no longer had a reason to rise. That evening, an officer from the Air Ministry arrived with sealed envelopes. Inside, orders to cease all unauthorized maintenance operations and prepare equipment for immediate decommission. No mention of thanks. No acknowledgement that without those unauthorized operations, Fighter Command would have run out of aircraft 2 years earlier. Simmons read the paper by lantern light, folded it carefully, and said to his crew, "They've decided to end a factory that never existed." No one spoke. They worked through the night one last time, stripping usable tools, burning old ledgers, burying damaged components in shallow pits so auditors wouldn't find them. By dawn, the works was gone. Only tire tracks remained and the smell of metal and oil that would never quite wash away. When the inspectors finally came, they found an empty barn. They marked their forms, no evidence of current production. They never thought to look beneath the floorboards, where a small box held 47 brass plates stamped TS, all that was left of 1,000 invisible aircraft. Simmons didn't return to London. He moved inland to a small village near Banbury, where he opened a repair shop for farm equipment. Customers brought him broken plows and threshers. He fixed them with the same precision he once used on Spitfires. He never talked about the war. The ministry never mentioned him. Officially, he'd been technical advisor, temporary, for 3 years, a title that meant nothing and explained less. But the pilots remembered. In 1946, Flight Lieutenant Carmichael found him in his workshop, hands black with grease, sleeves rolled to the elbow. Carmichael leaned against the doorframe and said, "I flew one of your ghosts at Dieppe. She brought me home on half a wing. If you ever wonder whether it mattered, it did." He left without another word. Simmons didn't look up. He just tightened a bolt until his hands stopped shaking. In 1947, Parliament held hearings on wartime expenditure. Among the documents presented was a brief memo from the Ministry of Aircraft Production. Anomalous field output untraceable. Estimated 600 aircraft produced outside standard factory controls. No cost records. No serial continuity. No explanation. The committee chairman underlined the last phrase twice and moved on. The report was never published. Years later, fragments of the story began to surface. A historian at the Royal Air Force Museum found an engine log with TS initials, dated December 1941. Another researcher discovered maintenance forms signed E. Simmons, but filed under miscellaneous. They tried to trace him, but there was no address, no military record, no pension file. It was as if he'd vanished between the cracks of bureaucracy, which, in a way, he had. The truth circulated only as whispers among veterans. They called him the man who rebuilt Spitfires from scrap. To the men who flew them, that was title enough. By the 1950s, Britain's skies belonged to jets. The Spitfire was history, relegated to museums and memorial flyovers. But even as technology advanced, engineers at Rolls-Royce and Vickers occasionally found themselves copying field repairs from Simmons's old teddy sheets. The rivet spacing, the stress distribution on improvised spars, his methods had become engineering doctrine without ever being written down. In 1963, one of the old resurrection wagons was discovered in a farmer's shed near Guildford. The truck's wooden sides had rotted, its tires gone, but the welding rig still bore the faint stencil, property of 43 Mu. Inside the glove compartment lay a photograph, 4 men and 2 women standing beside a half-finished Spitfire, smoke curling from their overalls. On the back, in pencil, "The Ghosts at Work, 1941. No names, no location, just that. Simmons died in 1967. No obituary. The local paper mentioned only that Mystery Simmons, mechanic, formerly of Farborough, passed peacefully at home. The vicar who conducted the funeral had never heard of him. 3 men in worn raft coats stood at the graveside and said nothing. One of them placed a single Spitfire propeller badge on the coffin. When the earth fell, it made the sound of rain on aluminum. For 2 decades, the story faded. Then in 1983, a retired engineer named John Harland wrote an article for Flight International titled "The Factory That Never Existed." It described a clandestine repair network, a nameless foreman, and aircraft built from wreckage during the Blitz. The piece cited anonymous veterans, recovered brass tags, and shipping manifests that shouldn't have existed. Historians debated its authenticity for years. Some called it myth. Others called it the missing link that explained how Britain's squadrons stayed in the air when production had supposedly stopped. In 1997, a museum curator cleaning an old Spitfire at Duxford noticed a small plate under the seat. The letters were almost worn away, but under a magnifying glass they read clearly. T.S. When the curator asked veterans if they recognized it, one elderly mechanic smiled. "We used to say if you saw those letters, you were flying one of Teddy's ghosts. You'd better treat her kindly. She'd already died once." Today, no document officially acknowledges the shadow line. The ledgers burned, the reports destroyed, the photographs faded to dust. But the evidence still flies. Out of the 74 surviving Spitfires in museums and private collections, at least 12 bear field welds that match Simmons's unique hand, slightly asymmetric, hammered twice to align the grain. The machines themselves remember, even if the archives do not. It said that during the Battle of Britain, the RAF never ran out of aircraft. That wasn't true. They ran out every week, and every week in barns and bus depots and muddy fields, men like Simmons built them again, not for glory, Not for medals, just so another pilot could take off in the morning. History records the victories of those who flew. It forgets the quiet hands that rebuilt their wings. But if you ever stand beneath a Spitfire and run your fingers along the weld seams, remember this: somewhere in that metal lies a fragment of a wreck that should have been scrap, and the work of a man who refused to let it die. Because wars are not only won by heroes in the sky. Sometimes they are won by the ones who never took off.